All right, sounds good. I will share my screen. Oh, would you be able to enable screen sharing?
Yeah, sorry about that. Give us a second.
Okay, thanks.
You are now co-host, so you can go ahead and share. Sorry about that.
Oh no, you're all good. All right. Okay, are you all able to see my screen?
Yep.
Awesome. All right, so I'm here to talk today about this movement that started last semester at William and Mary called the Carbon Fee and Dividend Movement. And again, I'm Emily, and I'm with Citizens Climate Lobby, which is a national organization that lobbies Congress for really impactful climate policies. So climate change, obviously, it's probably one of the big reasons that we're here, conservation, sustainability, climate. As young people, this is something that has the power to, drastically shape our lives, and we want to make sure that we are mitigating it in the best way possible. It's hard with climate change. Sometimes you think, what can we do in the grand scheme of things on a day-to-day basis? We'll eat less meat, we'll drive less, we'll do all these, and it's all important, but in the totally grand scheme of things, are we doing anything to reverse the trends of climate change? And so I was really inspired by Greta Thunberg's climate strikes and the snowball effect that she had. And I was thinking, I think she's totally right. If we're going to get something big about climate change done, then we're going to need the power of collective action. But I was also thinking, with climate strikes, not everyone is able to strike for the planet because they, have jobs and school to go to. And maybe it's just like something that a lot of people who care about climate change wouldn't be comfortable necessarily doing. And so what is a movement that could be super accessible and sustain over time? And then also, what is a movement that could be actionable? When I think of large scale climate activism, I think of signs that say, there's no planet B, and we need to end all fossil fuels. And I think it's really important for people to be pushing that narrative and shifting the needle on that. I also do think that it's important to have actionable goals. And so that brings us to the carbon fee and dividend. And actually, I want to see if I can do, how many people are familiar with the carbon fee and dividend policy? Could there be a show of hands? Okay, I'm seeing three hands. Okay. Yeah, it is really not that well known of a policy, which is very surprising because it is the single most effective climate policy that could be passed in the US in terms of reducing emissions. And so what it does is it makes corporations pay a fee to extract fossil fuels. So take this hypothetical oil rig, for example. If it extracts, I just went back a slide. If it extracts a little bit of oil, it will have to pay a small fee. If it extracts more oil, it's going to have to pay a higher fee. And if it extracts a bunch of oil, or this is just fossil fuels in general, coal, oil, natural gas, it'll have to extract a bunch, or it'll have to pay a very high fee. And so what this does is this will affect the economy. So starting at the source, it'll become more expensive to be the polluter. From those buying from the polluter, it will be more expensive for them. And so all products that kind of require fossil fuels will become more expensive with this price on fossil fuel extraction. So it'll affect the entire economy. And what will happen is, for example, a car with very little carbon emissions, and that requires very little fossil fuels to manufacture and maintain, that will become much cheaper in comparison to a car that requires a lot of fossil fuels and has a really high carbon emissions. And so what this really does is it allows consumers to make green choices easily. There's no like trying to convince people to like care about the planet, even though I think we should be doing that. It's like at the scale and speed that we need change, what really has the power to shift behavior is if prices change. You know, if I ask my parents, I've probably done that. I've been like, maybe we should eat less meat, or like maybe we should compost or something. And I, you know, it's hard. It's really hard to convince people to like change their whole like value systems. And but if the price of meat went really high, or if it became like, if you got fined for composting or something, then I think that's when my parents would be like, okay, let's make the change. So really to make scale, to make change huge and fast, like the prices will need to change. And then also it's really just holding people accountable for their pollution. You know, someone can have the freedom to say, okay, maybe I will drive around and have a ton of joy rides like every day. Maybe I'll go on like a 5-hour car ride, just very hypothetically. I don't think anyone would do that. But, you know, if that person is going to do that, then they have to pay for that, because there are so many external costs of carbon that we are taking in, like from the environmental impacts to the health impacts. It's like they're putting these costs out, but it's not within the price of like when they purchase the car or when they like fly the plane or anything. So this really needs to be embedded in the price of products. And so one of the common criticisms about carbon pricing, which a carbon fee and dividend is, it's a form of carbon pricing, is that it's not equitable. You know, if you just start putting a fee on fossil fuels and carbon emissions, then lower and middle income Americans aren't going to be able to afford these gradually increasing prices. So what makes this policy so special is that all the money from the fee, the revenue from the fee, gets collected and distributed equally to all Americans. So this actually makes it so that the majority of Americans, around 2/3, will break even or profit from the money coming back to them in these cashback payments. Then they have to pay in increased prices. So it's a really equitable policy, and it covers the most vulnerable populations. And so there's a really cool simulation called En-ROADS, which shows just how powerful carbon pricing is. And this is a global climate policy simulator created by MIT researchers. It's such a cool tool. Let's see if it'll load. Okay. So En-ROADS, it shows that we're on track to increase global temperatures by 3.3 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, which is catastrophically high. Let's say we plant a bunch of trees, afforestation. What would happen then? So a little impact. Let's say we did a really good job electrifying transportation. What would happen? Also a little impact. Or let's say we highly taxed coal. What would happen? Also a slight impact. Are there any that you guys would be curious about seeing before I show what a carbon price would do?
Could we see renewable energy or energy efficiency?
Yeah. So renewables, if we highly subsidize renewables. And then energy efficiency for transportation.
You could see nuclear.
Nuclear, yeah. So if we go up with the nuclear is such an interesting one. I personally don't, I think I should know more about nuclear, but and then if we highly taxed it. Okay, any other ones, or I can just start showing what carbon pricing will do. Okay, so basically with all these policies are important. Like we need to be tackling climate change in any way we can. We will need really big hitter policies in addition to ensure that we meet our climate targets. So what a carbon fee and dividend is, this form of carbon pricing, this is what carbon pricing, the impact of it is on a global scale. Drum roll. Oh. So this is by far like the most impactful thing that can be done in terms of reducing emissions alone. And if we don't have carbon pricing on national scales, then we are not going to get even close to our climate targets. So it is so important that we pass carbon pricing at the scale that is necessary. In addition, carbon pricing has tremendous economist support and as specifically a carbon fee and dividend. So the largest public statement of economists in history advocates for this policy, a carbon fee and dividend, as the most effective climate policy we could pass. And their statement is signed by over 3,600 economists. And it says, a carbon tax offers the most cost-effective lever to reduce carbon emissions at the scale and speed that is necessary. So they're saying this is the most powerful tool that we have. And also to maximize the fairness and political viability of a rising carbon tax, all the revenue should be returned directly to US citizens through equal lump sum rebates. So they're also saying we need the dividend part as well in order to make sure it's equitable and for it to be politically feasible. And it is so cool on this website. It shows all the economists who have signed this statement. And I go to William and Mary right now. So if I search up William and Mary, there's like 13 professors from William and Mary who have signed this statement. And if I search up University of Virginia, there's 24 professors from University of Virginia who have signed. Are there any colleges that you would want me to like kind of do a little search for right now? Like any colleges that you guys go to?
We do George Mason University.
Yeah, George Mason. So there are 5 professors from George Mason who have signed. So it is widely agreed upon by economists, like this is the most powerful climate tool that we have. And so, so the big question is, if this policy is so important, if this is like the most effective tool that we have, then how do we get it? And unfortunately, the US has not had the political will yet to pass this. And Citizens Climate Lobby has been advocating for this for over a decade. What's exciting is it's going to get reintroduced in Congress soon. But there needs to be this kind of pressure to ensure that it gets passed. And even if it doesn't pass in this Congress, for this building support to happen. And so what we did at William and Mary last semester, we started a student-led collective action movement for it. And so the idea behind the movement is for there to be a sign. And the sign just says, most effective climate policy, #carbon fee and dividend, bit.ly/write Congress here, which is a link to an already formatted letter to Congress. And I have like a little sign right here. They're just like usually paper sized. And so the idea is for students to like make a sign and just show it where they can, like on laptops, on dorm doors or windows, or propped up in public, in dining halls and libraries. So the idea is it is like super passive and easy to do so that it can sustain over time, because this is something that we don't know exactly when this will get passed. And so just building a sustained support for it. And the vision is for one student, to start with a sign and other students to see it and be like, oh, what's that? And maybe learn. And then realize, okay, this is important, and for more people to join in. And as this is happening, for more and more people to actually click the link to write Congress, it takes like less than 2 minutes to write Congress from this link because it's an already formatted letter. And so it's getting people, like, it's taking it a step further from just having a sign. It's like, actually, here's how you can take action to contact the people who can actually make the change. And so for it to continue spreading, and eventually for all students across America to be like, Congress, we want a carbon fee and dividend, and exert this huge pressure on Congress. And, you know, the state of our state of politics and everything, like, even if, you know, thinking about, is it politically feasible to have like Congress people just like change their mind? That's a question, that's a really important question. And so even just making it a core, like a very core environmental issue that a lot of people are willing to vote around, like asking Congress members, like, are you going to vote for a carbon fee and dividend? If yes, if no, you know, we will vote on you depending. And so really just exerting this humongous public pressure for this policy. And so this was me at William and Mary. This is like day one of the movement. This is like me at a dining hall. I'm thinking like, oh, let me try to like start a collective action movement. And this was about a week or so into the movement, and more people at William and Mary are making signs. And this is kind of, it's steadily growing. And it's even like beyond these photos. And but it's incredible. We saw this snowball effect happen at William and Mary, and this policy that almost like no one knew about at William and Mary, it became like very like, oh, I see these like carbon fee and dividend signs everywhere. Like, what is this? And so the kind of stuff that we've done, lots of advertising, like a crazy amount of advertising, just flyers, carbon fee and dividend flyers everywhere. Caroline, you might be able to attest to this, and stickers and writing on chalkboards and whiteboards, and I given like a ridiculous amount of presentations and huge chalk murals. So you kind of could not escape the carbon fee and dividend movement on William and Mary's campus, which I think is awesome. I hope it didn't get too annoying, but I think it's important, so it's totally justified. And then at the end of the semester, we had a large gathering of students come together to show their support for a carbon fee and dividend. And so what's really exciting is that we are officially now going to be housed within Citizens Climate Lobby for Citizens Climate Lobby students. So this is big because it'll allow this sustaining of the movement. There have been a couple efforts to have carbon pricing movements, but they have not been able to sustain. So because we're going to be housed in an official organization that's already really well established, I think this will be really big. And we're also going to be partnering with Fridays for Future and tapping into this network of really passionate climate activists. And so it's really cool. We are like this like hybrid in a way. We're like taking the Citizens Climate Lobby method, like reaching out to representatives, doing this like very like focused call to action, this carbon pricing, and we're taking this youth energy and like the signs and being bold, and we're like combining them into a movement. And so I always say, you know, the time to be revolutionary is now. Climate change is not looking like it's going to slow down anytime soon. So while we are in school, you know, it is especially we especially have this time where we have the power of collective action. And that's a power that we might not have again once we like graduate and everyone's like, it's harder to work as a collective. And so really trying to take advantage of that is important. And then we also have an Instagram, which is just Carbon Fee and Dividend. And we also have a Slack, which is where we kind of organize nationally, and we encourage those who are interested in bringing the carbon fee and dividend movement to their school to, if they have a CCL chapter, bringing it through that. But also, if there isn't a CCL chapter that exists, either if they want to make one, that would be highly encouraged, or just bringing the movement to an environmental group that already exists and might want to take on the movement. And we also have a website, which is just cfdmovement.com. And this has other resources to help get the movement started. And this is all pretty new. So there's a lot of room for growth, and we're going to be like adding more to the Instagram, like working our Slack out more, but to start getting the infrastructure for the movement down, that's really important. And we would love if you were interested in joining in or yeah, in any way possible. And then I also put my name and email and William and Mary 24 again. So if you want to contact me, please feel free. I would love to chat or meet again. And yeah, thank you. That is my presentation.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Emily. Yeah, like she said, I'm also a William Mary student, and I can definitely attest to this movement growing so much on campus. Like, it's crazy to see, yeah, the difference. And it's super cool. So props to you, Emily. I will now open the floor for a Q&A session. If you have questions about the policy, about the movement, about what Emily does, literally anything, go ahead, whoever has questions.
Yeah, I have a question. I know you talked about this in your presentation, but I think my Wi-Fi just cut out a little bit. Could you explain the equity concerns with the carbon fee and dividend again for me?
Yeah, so the main concern is that when you put a price on carbon and then prices are going to start increasing for Americans, like especially fossil fuel intensive products. So in order to ensure that lower and middle income Americans can afford this transition, it's important to take all the revenue from the fee and distribute it equally to all Americans. And that will ensure that they can afford it. So that's the main way that it addresses the equity concern.
Yeah, I have a question, quick follow-up on that. So when you say distribute the revenue to low and middle income, would that be like through community investment and policy? Is that direct payment? Is that still being figured out?
Yeah, so with the policy that's getting introduced in Congress, the Energy Innovation Act, it would be in like monthly checks, like just directly to people. There is debate among how the dividends should be used. Some people think that we should focus it on like why are we even paying like very wealthy people the dividend too? Like it's kind of like, is it their lunch money kind of, but there's a lot of, so there's just a lot of debate about should we invest it into clean energy technology, should we give it straight to the people? And what the most important thing is that the carbon price exists in the first place, because that's the only way we're going to reduce emissions. And so how the dividend actually works can be kind of an afterthought. It's important if we really are serious about addressing equity, but just like having the carbon price in place first is the most important, and then we can kind of tweak and figure out what is the best way for us to use the dividend. And there are also different policy proposals. So the Energy Innovation Act is one, but there are also others that have the dividend money distributed differently. That's a good question. Yeah.
Go ahead, Adriana.
Yeah, I was just checking out the Instagram and it just looks so fantastic. I was just curious on kind of like the marketing behind it. Like how long did it take to create like even the logo and like figure out who could design it and everything like that, and then kind of I'm assuming you have like a social media team even if it's small at this point, or maybe it's just you. I'm not sure, but then just like I want to know kind of the details behind how long it took to create that and how difficult it was.
Yeah. So last semester when we had started this, I spent like all my waking hours on this movement. It was like insanity. I spent a lot of time like designing the logo and the flyer, and I'm like the main social media person, and I think so a lot of it has been like the power of one person in the movement can be seen. I think I think the hardest part of any movement is like starting it from scratch. So, at the very beginning when everybody's like, wait, what is this? I don't really no, like I don't see anyone else doing it. That's the hardest part. And now we're starting to reach this point where it like looks like, oh yeah, this is a movement and it looks cool to join in. So I think in the future, it will become easier to advertise because it's kind of already well established, but bringing it from the ground up took like a ridiculous amount of work. But I think it all, it was worth it, to see it grow at William and Mary. No, I appreciate that question because it took a lot.
Yeah, Chloe.
Yeah, I was wondering, you were talking about how it's going to be like brought to Congress this next year. Can you just talk more about that?
Yeah, so I don't know exactly when it's going to be reintroduced, but I'm kind of guessing in the next several months. And I have the person's name who is going to be introducing it. It's a representative from California, Carbajal, and they're going to be the lead sponsor. And so what is ideal is for this to be supported in a bipartisan way. And last time it was introduced, there was a Republican representative who co-sponsored it, which was really big. And they want to find another Republican to co-sponsor it, but I think there's been some challenge with that. So, but in terms of like marketing it to other Congress people and like for it to sustain over time, we want it to be as bipartisan as possible. And that's one of Citizens Climate Lobby's values, is nonpartisanship/bipartisanship.
I have a quick question. I don't know if it makes sense, but like, I guess I'm wondering, how would this, like the fee, deal with sort of industries that require like fossil fuel intensive activities, but are like for sustainable purposes? Like electric vehicles comes to mind, like the mining for the minerals for the batteries is like, I'm assuming fossil fuel intensive, but then like the end product is sustainable. So like how does that work?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of nuances to this policy, which is interesting. It's and I'm not like, I don't study economics intensely, so I feel like I actually I'm not able to answer that well, but what I would assume is that the fee would just work as is, and even sustainable industries would try to find even more sustainable ways potentially to where can they cut costs, like where can they cut the most fossil fuel costs to make their products. I think it will I assume that it would just have a much harder hit on fossil fuel, like bigger, not like, I assume that it wouldn't have the biggest hit on those industries because they would also be because of the fee and people are like spending money on clean energy. This is going to spur a lot of technological innovation for clean energy. So it'll be this anything sustainable will kind of be moving in the right directions, and they might have the setback from the fee a little bit, but they are just generally moving in the right direction because this fee is gradually increasing over time. So I think I don't think that it would be that big of a challenge. But actually, I wonder if Bill, you have any thoughts on that?
The price is the price. The price should work its way through in every dimension. So my answer is that you basically got it right. Even resources that are used for things we think of as good things should face the same carbon price. Otherwise, you're not giving the industries that do some good stuff the same incentive to reduce their emissions and to find cheaper ways of doing stuff than other industries. So you want it to operate across the whole economy.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
If there are no other questions, I think we can move on to Professor Shobe's presentation then. And at the end, we will have more time for questions for both Professor Shobe and Emily if anything shows up. So keep your questions in your head. And Professor Shobe, the floor is all yours.
All right, can you see it? Oh, not yet. How about that?
Yes, that's
Yes.
great.
Great. Okay. All right, Emily, there's no way I can match Emily's enthusiasm. I'm amazed at all the energy there and the great enthusiasm. And I agree with much of what she said. For an economist, it's all about getting a price on carbon. The difference between what Emily has said and what I'm going to talk about is there are two basic ways of getting a price on carbon. One is to pick a price. And since I don't know how to do that, I'm going to look for another way to set a price. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to put a cap on carbon emissions, but then let the sources of emissions under the economy trade those emission allowances, and I'll describe how those are set in a minute, and that will set the price for us. So, but the goal in the end is to get a price on carbon. So the best policies, options that we have are policies that set a price on carbon. Up till now, the most used policies for pricing carbon are emission trading programs, what we call cap and trade programs. And in fact, until very recently, Virginia was, in fact, we still are briefly, a member of what's called the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is a group of states in the eastern US that have capped their CO2 emissions and have a market for those emission allowances, and that sets the price on emissions. And I'm going to talk about RGGI mostly today, and I'm going to talk about the details of how it works. I want to go in some detail so you understand basically how a cap and trade system works, how it sets prices. This is the most used carbon pricing policy across the planet. It's used a lot in the US, the RGGI states, California, Washington, Oregon. New York is about to cap its emissions across the whole economy in a more aggressive way than the rest of RGGI. The European Union is under a cap on emissions. New Zealand has a cap. South Korea has a cap on emissions. And all of these economies are doing this in order to set a price on emissions. So let's talk about how cap and trade programs work and how they get us a price, and in fact, how it's worked so far. Oh, let's see. There we go. Okay, so how does cap and trade work? Well, the first thing you got to do is cap your emissions. And in thinking about how you do that, you pick the sources that are covered by the cap, and then you set a total mass cap on emissions. And so that'll be tons. So Virginia's cap under RGGI when we first joined was about 28 million tons a year of emissions. And the law required that cap to decline every year until it got to zero in 2050. And I'll show you more about that in a minute. So you set a cap on emissions, you divide it up into chunks called allowances. Each allowance is worth a ton of CO2 emissions. And then you get that out to the economy by selling them or granting them for free. And then the sources that are responsible for emissions have to buy them and use them for their emissions, but these can be bought and sold like any other asset in the economy. And if you want to emit a ton of CO2, you got to retire an allowance. And monitoring is actually done by, at least for the electricity sector under RGGI, we have continuous emission monitors on stacks, on emissions for power plants. And so monitoring is actually very straightforward. Wrong way. Okay, so how do we get a price out of this? Well, the price is determined by the market. There are auctions, and I'll talk about the auctions more in a minute, and the bidding for allowances in the auction and the trading of allowances in over-the-counter markets and contracting gives us a price on emissions. And I'll show you what the prices have been in our own regional greenhouse gas initiative. The price is determined, and I'll talk about the auctions a little bit more in a minute. Okay, keep going the wrong way. Now, so you divide the cap. Remember, the cap is a fixed limit on emissions. This is one reason I like cap and trade programs so much relative to a tax program, which also sets a price on emissions. And that's good. I don't want to be heard criticizing the idea of taxing emissions, but I like a cap and trade program because I get a cap. I get a certainty over how quickly we reduce emissions, which you can't really get as well if you set a tax. You have to watch and see, well, what do I get in terms of emissions after I set the tax? Is it enough? If not, I raise the tax. If it's too much, I lower the tax. So you set the cap, you set the plan for reducing the cap over time. And one allowance, as I said, is worth a ton of emissions. And then states have their allocation, their budget. And so each state will allocate out these allowances to their sources in their economy. But the market is one big market across the whole region, and anyone can buy and sell these allowances, just like Oreos, my favorite commodity. Okay, so why do I like cap and trade programs so much? Well, first of all, they set a price, which I love. Got to have a price on emissions, whether you set the tax or you do the price. And we have lots of theory and evidence that support our conclusion that programs that set prices on emissions get us emissions reductions at the lowest cost. We saw the acid rain program back in the 1990s with a cap and trade program. We set a cap on SO2 emissions, sulfur dioxide emissions. We lowered that cap over time. We got emissions way down, and we got them down at much lower cost than we thought. And we did that by letting the market set that price on emissions, and the price on emissions induced innovation all across the economy. Why is lowering costs so important? Well, lowering costs is important because the less it costs to reduce emissions, the faster we're going to want to do it, and the more emission reductions we're going to want to buy. It's a simple matter of supply and demand. So from an economist's point of view, getting that price down means we want to buy more clean environment. Okay, now, I want to talk about a brief history of RGGI. My talk is about RGGI because this is a carbon pricing program that is in place. Our state has been a member of this. Unfortunately, our governor is trying to pull us out of RGGI. This is very unfortunate, but maybe he will be able to do that. Maybe he won't. But New Jersey pulled out. I have a picture of Chris Christie here. Let me talk about the history of RGGI. The RGGI states started negotiating about capping their emissions back in 2003. They got a legal memorandum of understanding in 2005, which is sort of record time for implementing a policy among a bunch of states. Pretty amazing. They published their model rule in 2006. And in 2007, some additional states joined, not Virginia. We only joined in 2021. And then the program officially starts in 2009. Chris Christie announced he was going to run for governor, so he pulled New Jersey back out of RGGI as a political ploy to make himself more attractive to other Republicans. As it turns out, that didn't work out so well for him. New Jersey came back in as soon as the next governor was elected. In fact, in the next election, both the Democrat and Republican running for governor, New Jersey favored going back into RGGI. In the program review in 2012, the RGGI states realized it was costing a lot less than they thought it was going to reduce their emissions. So what did they do? They reduced their cap by 45%. And then in 2017, they reduced it even further. I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. So New Jersey rejoined, Virginia joined in 2021, Pennsylvania is sort of in the process of joining. It's being litigated right now. And North Carolina is also considering joining. So we have a huge cap. We have a cap on emissions from a number of states with lots of emissions. And that cap goes down every year. Okay. What does it take to join? You have to be a state. You have to negotiate a budget for your state based on your emissions and your efforts to reduce emissions over time. And you have to set up a system for allocating the allowances out into the economy. Normally, that's just participating in the RGGI auction. This rule only applies to, in RGGI, this only applies to the electricity sector. In other states like California, Washington, New York, in the European Union, and in other countries as well, the cap covers a larger share of the economy. But RGGI was an early actor and led the way with the electricity sector. So these other programs, when they were put in place, got to be more ambitious and set the cap on the whole economy. New York, as I said, is moving to expand the applicability of their cap. And I figure other RGGI states are going to do that as well once they have the example of New York to follow. Enforcement, as I mentioned, is pretty straightforward. We can monitor emissions from our power plants with continuous emission monitors. Enforcement is essentially 100%. Compliance is essentially 100%. One company went bankrupt and so didn't have enough emissions to cover what it had emitted, but it was just a small matter, and it's been the only case of non-compliance. I'm going to skip this about offsets. Probably you all know that economists don't believe offsets are really worth very much. Offsets and allowances are different. Offsets are not under a cap. The key here is the cap. The cap on emissions is what protects the environment and generates the price. So I'll leave this bit on offsets for another time. The auction, RGGI holds an auction every quarter for allowances. You can actually participate if you want. You can sign up to participate in the auction and put in bids for allowances. You buy a minimum lot, I think, is 1,000 allowances. And so these are auctioned off quarterly in a very straightforward auction. And I will say, just to give ourselves a little credit here, the auction design used in RGGI was designed right here at UVA. And we were the lead on the team that designed that auction. Very proud of that. Now, for those of you who studied some economics, just a quick graph. Don't worry if you haven't studied economics. The point here is there's a minimum price on allowances. That's the reserve price down here. So allowances aren't sold if the price isn't high enough. If the price goes wacky high, a small pot of allowances is available to add if the price is going to get way too high. And that's just to prevent things from, panic buying, from causing prices to spiral way too high or too low. Generally speaking, prices stay well within between the reserve price and the cap. By the way, if the reserve price is not met, those allowances not sold are retired. And I'll show you that actually happened early in the history of RGGI. Now, there's one other thing I want to point out, and this is also another kudo for UVA. There's another little spot here I want to show you. There's this little spot that we call the emission containment reserve. If the price of allowances falls lower than, right now, I think about $8, then up to 10% of the allowances can be retired. Because the price is lower than we thought, we can go ahead and tighten the cap. And so we added in this little extra step in the supply of emission allowances that ratchets down the cap if the price is nice and low. Okay, I've got to move on pretty quick here. There's a lot of trading in allowances, and so it's a very active market, and that's how the price is set. And let me talk about revenues for a minute, because the cap and dividend program spends a lot of time talking about rebating the revenues. RGGI has earned about $6 billion for the RGGI states. Virginia, $650 million since it joined. The money is used for two things. It's used for supporting flood resilience in Virginia, because we are suffering increased flood events because of climate change. And half the money goes for supporting energy efficient upgrades to housing in low income communities. So essentially the money is going back to help people who are subject to the consequences of climate change. And it's done in a way that we would call progressive. The money is spent in a way that helps lower income families. And how you spend the money is not key. You could rebate this money, you could spend it on other climate related things, or you could just lower taxes with it. That really doesn't matter in terms of how we're protecting the environment. Okay, here's the long and short of it here. The cap, the original RGGI cap was set this pink line right here. And it turns out the price was really, oh yeah, here's New Jersey leaving right there. When RGGI found out the price was going to be really low for their allowances, they just knocked the cap way down. That's this big fall right here. So the cap got knocked down by 45%. The increase here is with new states joining, New Jersey coming back in and Virginia joining. But every year the cap goes down, so emissions go down. All right. And I already talked about all this stuff. So here's the price. We got a price. Now, I'm a little skeptical about what we know about setting prices, which is why I like having markets set the price rather than thinking we know what price carbon emissions should have. I set the cap, I get my environmental result, and let the price float. That's why I like this way of doing it. But I don't want to, again, 100% of economists think pricing emissions is the right way to go. A lot of those economists who signed that statement you saw are probably indifferent between whether you do it with cap and trade or with a direct tax. They just want a price on carbon emissions. A lot of those names I recognize, and there are people, let's just get a price on carbon, whatever we do. So real quickly, when the RGGI program, this is the price we saw at auction. When the RGGI program first started, the price was really low for reasons I don't want to go into right now, but the cap was too high because they had overestimated how hard it would be to reduce emissions. We didn't know. And then when we set the cap, it turned out the price was really low. It was a lot easier to reduce emissions than we thought. And so what did RGGI do? They reduced the cap. And once they reduced the cap, the price started rising, and then they reduced the cap again, and the emission containment reserve policy was passed. And now we're talking about really substantial price for CO2 emissions. And the emissions in RGGI are falling year by year. Okay, I got to hurry up here. Virginia's budget, when we were in RGGI, was supposed to go to 0 by 2050. That's sort of a common goal these days, get our emissions down to 0 by 2050. And there are other things we want to do as well. But Virginia law was going to take our RGGI cap to 0 by 2050. And so we were going to have the cap declining every year so that 2050, we were not going to allocate any more allowances to our own sources after that year. And that would help us achieve our goal of eliminating emissions from the electricity sector by 2050. Now, let me just mention, the governor wants to pull us out of RGGI. Here's his main argument. The governor's argument is that, well, utilities can pass through the cost of these allowances, and so it doesn't really change their incentive about how they generate electricity. And I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but this argument is dead wrong, because the decision about which power plants to run is not made by the power plant operator. It's actually made in an auction where every power plant in our region bids to supply electricity in the next day, and they have to add the price of allowances to their bid. And so you're not going to pick sources to generate electricity that have that high allowance price associated with generation. You'd rather pick the sources that have lower costs because they're not paying allowance prices. So even though Dominion Energy gets to pass through the cost of generation, their dirty sources of electricity will not be chosen for generating electricity. Okay, I've gone on for a long time. That's it. I want to agree with Emily. Pricing carbon is the way to go. And we have two cool tools for doing that. And let me stop sharing. There. Oh, did I stop?
Yep, you're good. Thank you so much. Yeah, I would love to open up the floor to any questions that you guys have. Go ahead, Gabrielle.
Yeah, I have a question with the recent pulling out of RGGI. How do you foresee, do you see us going back to RGGI?
Sure. Yeah, you bet.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's great.
If we have a Democratic governor and legislature next year, we'll go next election, we'll go back in. That's what happened in New Jersey.
Yeah.
It's silly for us not to be in. It's the lowest cost way of getting our emissions down. Pricing emissions. I'm including Emily's way of pricing emissions too. Pricing emissions is the way to go. And we had a price on emissions and the governor has pulled us out. And a new General Assembly and a new governor will go right back in, and it's no problem. We can rejoin again. We've got our path, we've got our allowance pathway, and the law has that allowance cap going down every year. And so we're all set to go back in should we have the political will to do so.
Thank you.
Let me just,
there?
can I just make an editorial statement? I just want to point out how useful economics is in helping solve this problem. So economics, good. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just curious, are there initiatives like this in most regions of the US?
Only in places where the politics is in favor of doing something about emissions. There are discussions about this in Colorado, Minnesota, New Mexico, and other states. And like I say, California has a hugely successful cap and trade program that Quebec joined. And now Washington has put a cap on their emissions just last year and is implementing that and is talking about joining in California's market. Oregon has also implemented a cap on emissions. So the answer is yes. And the RGGI states have been expanding. If Pennsylvania joined, that would be huge. Pennsylvania is a huge emitter, and having them say, we too want to join in the coalition of the willing would be amazing. And Michigan might want to join as well. They're doing a lot these days. And so yeah, I haven't heard any official move in that direction, but these are states that might be the next ones to fall.
I just had a quick follow-up question, and then we'll go to Kelsey and then Luca. What makes Pennsylvania such a big emitter? I'm just curious.
They have huge coal resources and huge natural gas resources. That's why. We consume a lot of Pennsylvania electricity here in Virginia, and they were generating it from coal until just a couple of years ago, and their coal generation has dropped down to a fraction of what it is before. You may not know that in Virginia, we generate more electricity from solar than we do from coal. I hope you realize that. That is cool. And Pennsylvania is not a big solar state, but they're building wind. They are building some solar, but they're reducing their coal generation. They're substituting it for natural gas for it. And that's not perfect, right? We're going to go after the natural gas next, but it's reduced Pennsylvania's emission intensity for the electricity we use a lot.
Gotcha. Thank you. Kelsey, go ahead.
Do you foresee RGGI in Virginia like expanding in the future past just the electricity sector?
Only it depends, right? It depends on our political will. Pricing carbon is only going to happen in an administration that acknowledges that climate change is a serious problem and that pricing emissions is an important way to go. And so we have a model to follow, though. If we have the political will, we could easily join in with California and the Western Climate Initiative, California and Quebec and Washington and all the other states that have decided to cap their whole economy emissions. We can go there with the same mechanism. And that's really just a matter of having the political will. New York has made the move. They're the first state in RGGI to move to expand to an economy-wide cap. So I'm expecting other pins to fall.
Nice. We have a question in the chat from Luca asking if you could talk a little bit where flood mitigation and prevention will be heading in Virginia with RGGI being temporarily suspended.
Yeah, so the whole idea, we have increased costs from flooding, not just in the coasts, right? Our mountain regions have serious problems with flooding and they're getting worse. Grundy, Virginia is a famous town for flooding. They had to move the entire town to get it out of harm's way, not far from where I grew up, actually. We will be spending state money cleaning up after floods, whether it comes from RGGI or not. So for the governor to say that RGGI tax money, isn't needed to spend on flood resilience, we are going to be spending money. It's better to spend it preventing serious damage from floods than cleaning up after the damage is done. Leaving RGGI means we will stop spending on flood resilience in advance, and instead we will be spending on emergency response to flooding after it happens. That's more expensive. You let the damage happen. A penny saved is a penny earned, right? Stitch in time saves 9. Ben Franklin had this all down. So the answer is we'll be spending more money and letting the damage happen first, rather than spending the money up front, planning for flood resilience, planning for communities, leaving buffers where flooding happens. And so I think the answer is we will end up with spending a lot more money on flooding, but just from general taxes rather than from RGGI. Did that answer your question, Luca? I take it that's a yes.
I think that's a yes, yeah. All right, any more questions?
Yeah, I had a question on RGGI. I was a little bit confused about how the auctions work. So essentially we're setting a cap. Yep. And then with that cap, through the auctions, prices fluctuate in order to distribute to maximize the amount of allowances we are given. Is that correct?
Well, I would say it a little differently, but basically that's right. So we're not setting the price. We are setting the cap on emissions, and the cap goes down every year. And what happens is RGGI sets the aggregate cap and then allocates out budgets to the states, and each state will get the revenue from what it sells at the auction. In the quarterly auction, all the allowances are put into the big pool, and all the compliance entities in RGGI go to the same auction to buy their allowances, and brokers participate, and all kinds of market actors participate. And everybody's thinking about, well, what am I going to need in the future? And should I save some for the future? The cap is going down, the price is going to go up. Maybe I better buy some and save them, or maybe not. Maybe I'll wait till next year when it's cooler. And so everybody's making their decision about how they want to bid for allowances this year. But it turns out that generally speaking, sources will bid pretty close to the cost of reducing emissions. And that's good for us because in the auction, the price we get from the auction is sort of an estimate of what the market is telling us about the cost of reducing emissions. And the price we get is determined by the auction. But we have 4 a year, so we're dividing up the big pot of allowances, RGGI, by 4, selling a quarter of them in, let's see, we have auctions. Oh, yeah, I can't remember which months they are, but I think it starts in March, March through December, quarterly auctions. Did that answer your question? The price is set by, you know, the bids that are submitted, and you keep filling the bids until you run out of allowances, and the price is that last one you sold.
Yeah, thank you. That answered my question. A follow-up question for that then, and Emily, you can chime in as well. How does that contrast, I guess, to a tax program where we're setting the price? How do we fluctuate? I guess we're not fluctuating the price, but how would we fluctuate the price in order to get what we want? That's not a good question.
No, I think that's a good question.
I understood. I thought it was a good question. Yeah.
I think for a carbon tax, so they decide in Congress initially, right? And then if I have to look into this more too, but Bill, is it the case that it just can be changed? It just has to, Congress has to make changes to it over time, but that's not like the hardest part is getting it passed in the first place, and then the changes are a little easier.
Well, remember the tax the Citizens Climate Lobby is proposing is when you first pass it, it is specifically designed to go up every year.
Mm-hmm.
So you're building into the law an increase in the price every year. We have to agree on the initial price and how much it goes up every year. But then over time, you're going to observe how much reduction you get. And you're going to have to go back to Congress and say, we're getting more than we thought, so we should lower the price, or we're getting less than we thought. We're not doing enough environmental protection. We have to raise the price. I mean, I'm not a political scientist. My intuition is that that's not so easy. That's one reason I like setting the price in the market, because I think going back to Congress, I mean, look at what we get from Congress these days. Going back to them and ask them to increase the carbon price because we aren't getting enough reductions. Well, it's going to depend. Do we have one House with Republican leadership? They're not going to want to raise the price, right? We know that in advance. So this is a, you know, this is a political issue, right? Not an economic issue. It's just, we do have to go back to Congress and ask for changes as we observe the outcome of whatever price we set.
Thank you. I guess my last follow-up question on that. So where cap and trade program, the cap slowly goes down until we have zero carbon emissions. The tax would have an increasing tax until the price of the tax is so high that no one's willing to pay.
Yep,
okay.
That's the idea.
Thank you.
These two things are reflections of one another. In economic theory, it's either one, right? If in a perfect world, that perfect macroeconomic model, you either set the price and you get the quantity, or you set the quantity and you get the price. So Emily and I are just approaching it from the two sides of that same coin.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I think it's great that we have both of you guys here talking, so we can kind of hear, you know, two different really good solutions.
Yep.
Yeah, no, it's super interesting. If there are any other questions, speak now. Otherwise, we'll start wrapping it up. Okay, well, I think we can finish here. Thank you again so much to everyone who joined, and to Emily and Bill for speaking. It was an amazing presentation, really insightful, and just, it's getting me excited again about climate policies and everything. I don't know, I feel very energized right now. But yeah, a reminder to everyone that our next and actually last session, sadly, is next week of this summer speaker series. The topic is designing sustainable cities and infrastructure. Really excited for that one. I think it'll be super cool. And so that's again next week on Thursday, July 27th, same time from 10 a.m. to 11:15. So be sure to join that. I'll be sending out reminder emails. And yeah, it looks like a lot of people added to the info sheet, the spreadsheet. So that's great. Please connect with each other on LinkedIn. Yeah, that's all that I have for you guys. Thanks again for being here, and hopefully I'll see some of you again next week.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.